Hey class, we're starting chapter 13, Gothic cathedrals and Gothic art. So, Gothic art, the age of cathedrals. This is my subtitle because much of the art we're going to look at in this chapter is either in a cathedral, attached to a cathedral, or an actual cathedral. The Gothic style is Western art mid 12th century to the 16th century. It was first used to be kind of a negative idea to denigrate uh, pre-Renaissance art. Why do we say that? Well, because the Goths sacked Rome. So this is a negative idea for them, right? They're like, you're Gothic. They're saying it as a bad thing. Ute. You're Gothic. Ugh. So this was originally kind of a negative idea. It starts in France and it becomes an international style in Germany, England, Spain, and Austria. So it's one of the first international styles we're going to find. But before we get deep into the international style of Gothic art in the cathedrals, let's talk a little bit about what's going on here in the world during these time periods. It's very much an age of faith, right? It's society is a lot like we talked about in chapter 12 with the Romanesque art. Pilgrimage in monasteries, if you remember, we looked at that big cathedral in St. Foy Cathedral on the road to St. James and talked about pilgrimage and the monasteries that are all set up along the way and also the big cathedrals with relics. We talked about chivalry, knights having a code of conduct that they're supposed to follow, and how it's related to um, the Crusades and also courtly love. That people would be going off to war on the Crusades and they would leave behind knights to watch the castle, and there'd be affairs and trysts and all kinds of things in the nobility. We talked about how feudal power was the total structure of government and connected to the church in this day and age and back in chapter 12 as well, and how each layer gave something and was supposed to get something from the layers below. The king, being the one with all the land, gave it to people who were in charge, nobles who would take over huge tracts of land and then disseminate it down. And they would be giving money, taxes, knights, warriors up to him to be able to go off and fight and to manage it for him. And then goes down the line with them giving land to the knights to use, and they're supposed to give land and protection, but they're all getting things back and forth. So, not social mobility or necessarily social justice, but the way it's set up. When we talked about how there was a rise of towns happening, this continues to happen, and how some of them have charters from the king or lords or barons, and people could set up shop instead of moving around and peddling their stuff. They could actually have a place where they conducted business out of it, like blacksmithing or something. Then during this era, in the Last Crusade happening is 1271, 1272. Um, it's sometimes grouped with the Eighth Crusade, but a lot of people call it the Ninth Crusade. It's commonly considered to be the last medieval crusade to the Holy Land. So there's a little bit, depending on how people group them. Like I said in chapter 12, some people say there's in the very least six, but this is saying up to the ninth. So I don't want to get deeply into it, but that's the idea about that. We'll just say this is the last medieval one. So that's an important part of culture that's still happening all through this, well, for part of this time. 1271, that's the 13th century. So we're kind of halfway through this whole era of Gothic art with that. And then something very different. It's different from the feudal system, or affects the feudal system, I should say, not different from it. In 1215, there's cracks beginning to develop in that system and the class system because we have something that's very unusual the Magna Carta Libertarium, medieval Latin for the Great Charter of the Liberties, commonly called the Magna Carta. It's a charter agreed to by King John of England, that guy right there, um, to create a peace between an unpopular king and a group of rebel barons. So we have a situation. It was drafted by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was not a popular king, and there were a bunch of barons who were like sick of it and wanted to get rid of him, basically. And this is the start of an idea of limit of kingly power. So before that, what were we dealing with? We're dealing with divine right to rule. And we still are in certain parts of the world, right? Still dealing with this idea. So this guy's saying he's the divine right to rule. It doesn't matter. He's supposed to. And maybe even these guys would agree with that. But they're beginning to say, we don't like you, so go away. So this is getting weird. And we have here a guy saying, I want to keep the peace. So here is the Magna Carta. Right? A bunch of conflicting things going on. And there's the idea that's beginning to be kingly power should be limited. This is not followed through on, though, for quite a while, and we'll say none of this happens for 400 years. We don't even get any of it really happening until 400 years later with a constitutional monarchy in the UK. So Archbishop of Canterbury is an English archbishop. So this doesn't happen until 400 years later. So it takes a long time from this point to get to that. So here we are with that big idea of a crack. That's really what I'm trying to show you, is that things are beginning to, move and shake it up a bit. Important, really, really important document in the history of the world. As well as we get the beginning of the idea of organized trade, craftsmanship guilds, which would be sort of like we're thinking about nowadays unions, right? You can join a union to be an electrician or a builder. There's a lot of them, construction unions, plumbers, lots of other type of union. Chocolate makers have a union in the United States. Okay, there's a lot of different ones. Well, this is the beginning way back here of the idea of organizing trade and craft training, as well as skills that have a certain wage associated with them. So regulating wages, prices, and conditions of work. By joining together in these guilds, they had power together to be able to set their prices and not mess with each other, like undercutting each other constantly, and to have conditions that they could work in that were safer and be able to set things like that. So that was really important, as well as the idea of levels of like ability. There was a master and there were apprentices, etc., etc. So people were beginning to get a little bit more power when they had a craft or a trade that they could do. And we see this, a lot of it coming around skills that are used to build, for example, used to build cathedrals, so stained glass making, masonry, things like that. And there's a lot of different ones, though. We don't have time to talk about all of them. Also, during this period, 1440, so we're on a couple hundred years, the Romance languages begin to have literature in them rather than Latin. So Latin is now a dead language. People don't really speak Latin in regular everyday life. There's not a country that has Latin as their language, but it's so that's considered a dead or more like a language that's used for academic purposes and things like that. Well, these are the more common languages that people would use. Italian, French, Spanish, etc., etc. So we have Romance literature in Romance languages rather than Latin. There wasn't a printing press until later on. I said 1440 for this work, and I'm totally wrong about that. That was a mistake. I apologize. That wasn't until I looked at this date and didn't look at my notes. Um, there wasn't a printing press until 1440. This is the beginning part of it where we have the writing of this stuff, but not until later in this era do we have Gutenberg printing press, and he wanted to print the Bible, so that's why he did that. The Gutenberg Bible, one of the first printed documents. But we don't necessarily have the printing press right away, but we do have common languages and that are beginning to produce works of literature, which is a big deal. And we have in the 1200s the rise of universities. This is happening, started happening, it's happening in the medieval era. And to some extent or other, this is what our system, even now, the one you're part of right now, sitting in your living room, bedroom, wherever you are, listening to this lecture, is to some extent based on this. There was a need for a centralization of people and educated people to administer and record city life and daily life. So they needed people who could read and write and do things. So they did that. That was kind of part of it. And then there was also a rediscovery of the ancient Greek texts, like Aristotle, considered to be back then and in ancient Greece like the greatest thinker. Belief in truth through reason. This is an idea that's beginning to emerge again. And then the great books of the West that we talked about in chapter 11 that were kept by Islamic universities when the people went on the Crusades, there was they would get in contact with this, and there was the ability for them to bring back some of these great books of learning that they wanted in the universities and that they found out about. So we talked about that pretty extensively in chapter 11, about how there was in the Dark Ages the Islamic universities saved a lot of the classic Greek and Roman texts and things like that. So by 1200, Paris University is the preeminent institution of them all. So that university is still in existence today. It goes way, or a version of it, I should say, goes way back. And Thomas Aquinas is considered to be the premier intellectual of this era. He's a great scholar of his time, and he taught there in Paris as well as Bologna. He wrote a famous work from back then called Summa Theologica, and this is like many classic works have been translated into English and is available in libraries all over. You could probably find it in our Merced College library. This is a picture of him on the stained glass window. He's in this work reconciling ideas between Greek thought, so classical scholar philosophy, Greek thought, Greek philosophy, and a Christian belief system. And so this is changing the worldview and the shape of people's thinking starting way back then in this era, where faith and reason are starting to be brought together in different ways than they have done. Not to say that faith is unreasonable or that reason doesn't have faith associated with it, but the way in which he was bridging the gap between something like Aristotle and the kind of well-known Greek thinkers, philosophers with Christian beliefs were being merged in his work. So, important guy historically for that reason as an educator. There's a documentary that I want you to go watch right now. I have a link. It's the Nova documentary. It's on Vimeo. It's its own page that I want you to watch before you do anything else here. It's going to talk to you about how they built cathedrals. It's very interesting. It talks about some of the methodologies of doing it and different details. Shows you the way in which they've studied how they built them and people reaching for the skies and trying to get taller and taller cathedrals. It's really cool, so stop this video and go watch it now. Some of you will be thinking, oh, I'll watch it later. I won't even watch it at all. Well, you're gonna need to, because this recording is gonna be done, and I'll pick up with you in part two. So this will be part one. Then we'll have you watch that page. There's a link that says documentary, and then part two will pick up after that. So I want you to go check that out right now. All right. Hopefully you're all staying well. Talk to you later.